Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we welcome our guests Paul W. Franks and Yitzhak Y. Melamed, who will help us ask the question, what is Jewish philosophy? Before I begin, though, I'd like to acknowledge that this is our 200th episode. We've been doing Why Radio Monthly for 18 years, and I couldn't be prouder of the community we have created. To all the wonderful people at Prairie Public, as well as our enthusiastic and generous listeners around the world, thank you from the bottom of my soul for the honor of being a part of your philosophical lives. I hope we are together for another 200 episodes, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me and let me know your thoughts on the episodes that you found most meaningful. Now, let me take you back in time. It's the year 2007. I'm enjoying the newly published final book in the Harry Potter series. I had reread the previous 6 volumes to get in the mood and was almost done. By the way, after 21 years and a zillion movies, I'm assuming spoilers are okay. Anyway, I get to the climactic scene and Harry dies, and the next chapter is called King's Cross. I let out a disappointed sigh because I can tell what's going to happen next. Harry finds himself in the King's Cross train station, encounters the also-dead Professor Dumbledore, there's a conversation and an evil dying baby, and he is resurrected. Like so many before him, Harry Potter dies for everyone's sins. It happens in Superman, Gandalf, numerous Terminators. At the end of the third Matrix movie, Neo is carried away for a forced reboot with Keanu Reeves' arms literally stretched out, mimicking the dying Christ. It's just so boring. My kingdom for a new narrative. The academic word for this is Christological. And most Western art and culture assumes this point of view. The things characters do that are considered sinful, the depiction of how people pray, attitudes about rebellion and the threatening nature of questioning, the life cycles and harmonies are all Christian by default. Consider charity, which is of course a good thing. The word itself comes from the Latin caritas, which translated literally means Christian love. So, by definition, I, who am Jewish, can't give it. Instead, I engage in tzedakah, a Hebrew term for justice. The difference between the two is that charity must be given out of the goodness of one's heart. It must be sacrificial and joyous. Tzedakah can be undertaken reluctantly, with complaints and resentment, and it still counts. Because in Christianity, one gives charity to be redeemed. In Judaism, one engages in justice because it's the right thing to do. This is the heart of the Jewish religion. You do the right thing no matter what. You don't like your neighbor, you still help them. You disagree with your rabbis, that's okay. You question, you challenge, you argue, you even get infuriated with them. But you still honor their knowledge. Famously, in the Holocaust memoir Night, rabbis in the Auschwitz death camp held a trial charging God for allowing and ignoring evil. They found God guilty, and then they went on to evening prayers because that's what you're supposed to do. You can hate God or even disbelieve, but you still pray. I tell you these things because I want to underscore how invisible the differences between Judaism and Christianity can be. People wave them away, claiming that it's all the same God, so differences don't matter. I'm just speaking for myself here, not for my guests or anyone else, but I just don't think that's true. I think the Jewish and Christian gods are quite different, and I like it. I think it's interesting. On today's episode, we're not going to talk theology, and my guests aren't going to argue for the truth of the Jewish religion. We're going to look instead at the tradition of Jewish philosophy and how it differs from the mainstream ideas that dominate this show and philosophy in general. We're going to look at the same great questions we always do, but consider what kind of debates occur when they're built on Jewish rather than other assumptions. This will, as all philosophy does, harken back to the Greeks. It will celebrate a deep and fruitful discourse with Islamic philosophers. It will concern itself with morality, freedom, the meaning of life, and, yes, God. All the things we've been talking about together for 18 years. However, we have to begin with 2 questions. The first I've already answered. Is human experience really different through a Jewish lens? Yes. Yes, it is. The second is why Jewish philosophy is so unknown, why it's marginalized and disregarded. The reason is not because there are so few Jews in so many other religions. It's not because America is a Christian country, which is untrue, but a conversation for another time. The fact of the matter is that Jewish philosophers have been around at least as long as there's been philosophy. The earliest Jewish text predates Socrates. There were Jews and Jewish philosophers before, during, and after Rome. The medieval Christian philosophers who wrote and dominated the discussion were not just aware of them, they frequently refuted Jewish ideas and worked overtime to silence them, even to burn Jewish texts. The reason Jewish philosophy is unknown isn't because it's a minority point of view. It's because it is an alternative point of view, and even in the world of philosophy, alternatives are scary and dangerous. Which brings us back to Harry Potter. When I roll my eyes at J.K. Rowling naming the Resurrection chapter King's Cross, I understand why she did it. It's not subtle, but it is coherent. What frustrates me more is why the wizarding world, with its magic and ghosts and hidden segregated societies, celebrated Christmas. Hogwarts doesn't appear to have math class or engineering or creative writing. Their library doesn't have Louis Armstrong or Picasso or an internet through which to find them. Muggle knowledge and culture is banished, except for Christmas, which reveals a profound failure of the imagination and a stubborn unwillingness to genuinely play with reality, which is what fantasy novels are supposed to do. I hope on today's episode, we can avoid this narrowness and recognize how useful it is to see the world in endlessly different ways. Jewish philosophy is not a threat or a rejection. It is a benefit and a gift for all of us. It provides more ways to ask about truth and meaning. It enlarges us all. And now our guest. Paul W. Franks is the Robert F. and Patricia Weis Professor of Philosophy and Judaic Studies and Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. He's published a number of books on German idealism and theology. Yitzhak Y. Melamed is the Charlotte Bloomberg Professor of Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. He has published books on Spinoza and other areas of metaphysics, the history of ideas, and Jewish philosophy. Together, they've edited the Oxford Handbook of Jewish Philosophy Together, they have edited the Oxford Handbook of Jewish Philosophy, published last year by Oxford University Press. Paul and Yitzhak, welcome to Why.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, and congratulations on the 200th episode.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad to celebrate it with the two of you. It's really exciting.
It's our own.
To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Y Radio Show, WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show. And listen to all 18 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, yradioshow.org. And as always, this show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions, so click Donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So, Paul and Yitzhak, I want to jump right in where I left off. Jewish philosophy does not get a lot of attention. I suggested that this isn't really because there are so few Jews in the world. It's about Jewish philosophy being threatening to the status quo. Am I exaggerating this for effect? And how meaningful is the fact that Jewish philosophy is a minority philosophy? Does that change its character?
I think it is significant, to be honest. And actually, I think that the minority philosophy is always having some benefits, to be honest, because minorities do not buy the common truth of the majority. So in that sense, I think that, philosophers, especially homeless philosophers, are some of the boldest and most interesting figures. I studied Spinoza and Solomon Maimon, two homeless philosophers. And so in that sense, I think responding to philosophy from the margins is always a pleasure. And has the potential of illuminating blind spots. So I absolutely agree that Jewish philosophy is minority philosophy, and I think that's actually a virtue, not a vice.
I think it also brings out something characteristic of philosophy as such, which is perhaps surprising, You may think that German philosophy is just philosophy that's done in German, and French philosophy in French, and English philosophy in English, and it's all one language. I think there's something illusory about that. Jewish philosophy originates in translation between Hebrew primarily and other languages, usually the majority language. So between Hebrew and Greek, or Hebrew and Arabic, or Hebrew and German or English. And it's no accident that the major Jewish philosophers have also been involved in translation projects. But I think that brings out something universal, which is that universality, which philosophy always claims, is not a matter of speaking in a sort of pure universal language, but a matter of translation between one particular language and experience and another particular language and experience.
One of the characters of the Jewish diaspora, of the separation of Jews around the world, is that everyone speaks these different languages, as you're talking about, and there's some search for a common tongue. For many Jews, it was Yiddish, but as Hebrew grew in, modern Hebrew developed into sophistication, there was this bridging language. Is that process of finding a common language, is that a celebration of commonality, or is it a celebration of difference? Does it make knowledge easier in the sense that we have lots of different positions to combine, or does it make it harder because the differences often undermine the terms and the language and the metaphors? What does the separation of the Jewish tradition do to the common inquiry of Jewish philosophy?
So I would say that universality is not a fact or an established, settled feature of discourse. It's an achievement which is ongoing. And you see that in the translation project. Translation is not between two ready-formed languages, but also transforms them. You see that in English when there's so many phrases that come from the King James Bible, for example, where certain English phrases had to be made up in order to translate the Hebrew. So translation changes the target languages as well, and eventually you get the formation of a dialogue, and that's really the important thing.
I tend to think that actually plurality in many ways is built into the nature of Judaism and the way it developed. So, and I think that Jewish philosophy in many ways should reflect that. So the fact that within Rabbinic Judaism, at the end of the day, there was no central institution that can impose uniformity, at least in significant degree, I tend to take it as a blessing. I mean, the diversity of Jewish community, the geographical diversity of Jewish communities over 2,000 years allowed for its survival, right? If Jews were in any way limited in terms of their place of living to one geographical area, at the end of the day, they will not survive. So precisely this kind of vitality of living in different cultures, different places, conversation with different cultures, that's precisely the thing that I think that allowed for the survival of this culture for about 2.5 or 3 millennia. And the fact that there is no Vatican, and that chief rabbis usually are taken to be, or at least I take them to be, mostly clowns. I mean, they are not necessarily the most sophisticated rabbi. They are not necessarily the most known ones. There are people that have a nice appearance and they have a nice beard, etc. But they are not necessarily the top scholars. And usually they are not the top scholars, at least not in the Ashkenazi field. So the fact that you have this kind of radical decentralization seemed to me literally a huge virtue. And the Talmud itself is precisely this kind of chaotic sea in which all of these different tendencies are fighting each other for the benefit of all.
So there are about 17 things in that question that I want to ask
Sure.
follow-up questions about. The first, I want to call attention to the thing that you said, which points back to a theme that I introduced, which is you called the rabbis basically clowns, right? There is that sense of internal criticism, of poking
Chief rabbis.
fun, right? The chief rabbis, yes. Sorry,
Yeah,
I don't
chief
want to get
rabbis. I
anyone
mean,
in trouble. But the first question I want to ask is, I often say to my students when we talk about these sorts of issues, there's no such thing as Christianity, there's no such thing as Judaism, there's no such thing as Islam. There are Christianities, there are Judaisms, there are Islams. And so my
Precisely.
question is two parts. The first is, for someone outside the tradition, how much should someone think about Judaism as a unified tradition and as a monolith? And the second is, how important is Jewish philosophy to that survival need that you talk about, right? Hopefully everyone listening knows that the Jews have been under threat for all of history or almost all of history all around the world. And so this need to survive is an essential part of it. How much does the philosophical aspect of the conversation contribute to that survival process?
I think that there is some unity, but the unity is mostly, as far as I can see, is textual. I mean, there is a canonic text, at least till 2 centuries ago, there was an agreement more or less on the canonical texts. And there was an agreement, again, till the Enlightenment, there was an agreement on the respect for rabbinic authority, which I think that at the end of the day, that's the only thing that you needed. Now, I'll stress, just when we're speaking about rabbinic authority, I mean, it's a delicate issue because you have a distinction within this world between rabbis as priests, if you wish, or sacerdotes, as someone who is conducting religious functions, and as scholars. And I think that originally within Judaism, rabbis were scholars. They were Talmidei Chachamim, and there is a long tradition within the rabbinic world in which you're saying you should hate their rabbanut. I mean, you should hate the religious authority, right? Snarta rabbanut, whatever it means, and yet you are supposed to love Talmidei Chachamim, scholars, rabbinic scholars. So I think that in that sense, the fact that at the end of the day, the top religious figures are the scholars, not necessarily the hocus pocus priest or the rabbi who is just conducting some sort of hocus pocus. I think that's very significant. And the common core, again, for all I can tell, is at least till 2 centuries ago, was the Talmud and the walls around it.
For our listeners, I think it's important to understand that there is the Hebrew scriptures, right, the Bible, and then there are all these commentaries that rabbis and philosophers have used to explain the various different parts of the Bible. One of them is the Mishnah Torah, which we'll talk about later, but one of this is called the Talmud, which is a record of the conversations that the rabbis are having with each other about the meaning of the texts. So, and I'm going to ask a question about that in a minute, but just so for our listeners, what Yitzhak is saying is that the thing that unifies Judaism is the text, is not just the Hebrew scriptures, but the discussion about the interpretation, the Talmud, this text that Jews around the world throughout history for at least the last few hundred years have used this as the unifying point. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's my view. And especially because I think the Talmud itself is a cultic text. So it's not that he has any kind of specific dogma. Basically, on every single question, there are five views. So part of this entire discourse is the idea that almost everything, if you wish, is open to a discourse and conversation and undermining and further scrutiny.
Let me add to that there's a distinctive role that philosophy plays within Judaism because of the monumental works of Moses Maimonides in the 12th and early 13th centuries. So Maimonides is probably the greatest Jewish philosopher and wrote a great work called The Guide of the Perplexed. But he's also the only rabbi to have written a completely exhaustive code of Jewish law. And that code includes many philosophical elements. Now, although there was a very early attempt to react negatively against Maimonides, to reject his legacy, the consensus emerged very quickly that it simply could not be rejected. You could disagree with Maimonides, you could have a different attitude towards philosophy than he has, but you couldn't ignore it. So that means that for someone like myself who grew up in a very traditional Talmud-oriented Jewish community where people may have frowned on philosophy because they were worried about the various ideas that one might entertain, nevertheless, Maimonides was on the shelf. And you just have to open the code, not even the guide, but the code of Jewish law, to be introduced to philosophical ideas.
Jack, just to follow up, if I may,
Sure.
on this point of Paul, I mean, think about what happens to a culture where the major religious figure, religious author, and major religious legalist is also in some ways one of the boldest and perhaps even most heretical figures in terms of the boldness of the person's philosophy. And so, as Paul pointed out, there were strong attacks against Maimonides. But the fact that you have this figure that at the same time he is one of the, by far, clearly one of the leading Talmudists or leading rabbinic authority, and yet he's taking very bold positions religiously and philosophically, created a huge impact for the next 8 centuries. So just to give you a small example of this situation, we know, for example, that in this early 16th century, there was a custom in the city of Prague that anyone who would go and study the Guide of the Perplexed of Maimonides will give a special vow. What was the vow? The vow was listing a list of about 12 doctrines that are considered to be heretical in the Guide of the Perplexed. And the person who is taking the vow will say, I do not believe in them, but I also do not dare to ascribe them to the great scholar Maimonides. After you took this vow, you are free to study whatever you wish. Study the guide, that everything is fine. So you can see the duality, this kind of powerful tension in this very figure.
We have to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about this text, what it looks like, how that helps construct the discussion. And then we're going to talk about some of the great themes, including asking about what the difference is between a Jewish philosopher and a philosopher who's doing Jewish philosophy, and the tension between faith and logic, and all these ideas that permeate this kind of discussion. But before that, you are listening to Paul W. Franks and Yitzhak Y. Melamed and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
And we are back. You are listening to Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We are talking with Paul W. Franks and Yitzhak Y. Melamed, asking the question, what is Jewish philosophy? And we've been talking about the Talmud, which is this commentary text. And if you haven't ever seen a page of the Talmud, I recommend you look one up. I'll try to remember to link one on the show notes on our webpage. It looks like this grand puzzle. In the middle of the page is the text from the Holy Scriptures and in Hebrew. And then around it are all of these quotes and verses and comments that rabbis have added over the century. So it's this sort of graph, this puzzle, this design that shows the relationship of things. And then what happens is a rabbi will say something or write something, and then another rabbi will come along and they'll disagree with them, but they'll also have to respect and acknowledge the inherent value of the person. And so you get this page, and then, as was suggested by Paul before the break, you also get this phenomenon in Jewish households, right? Many religious households and the vision that people have of religious households, which is probably unfair, is that everyone has things they agree with and they don't like the opposition. But a Jewish household has shelves and shelves and shelves of books that list the things that you don't agree with. All the volumes that you want to criticize and complain about, but that you have to include in your investigation. So the question I have for both of you is, how much philosophy is in the Jewish religious texts, and how much philosophy is in treatises and books, right? We have this tension between theology and philosophy. Is Jewish philosophy done mostly in manuscripts like Spinoza, like Maimonides, like the three of us, right? Is philosophy done primarily in texts and essays and books, or is philosophy done between the cracks, underlining the debates that the rabbis have with each other about understanding the scripture?
I think the answer to that has changed over time. In the traditional Jewish curriculum and its institutions, there isn't really any specific place for Jewish philosophy or theology. So it has tended to be done in relationship to legal and Talmudic discourse. But there have been times when there has been a more institutional place for doing Jewish philosophy. And that is, at least in part, the case now, because, of course, there is also an academic discipline of Jewish philosophy. You can study it in the university. So I think right now, the traditional practice of doing it in the context of traditional Jewish textual study and discussion continues, but there's also the specific practice of Jewish philosophy with its own books and treatises.
I agree. I think that, again, I mean, yes, there is what you would normally call Jewish philosophy, but on the other hand, you also have a huge body of literature we call the Kabbalistic literature, which is strongly influenced by Greek philosophy in a way, or if you wish, Neoplatonism very significantly. There is a wonderful book that came recently by Tanya Wertmann on the influence of Neoplatonism on Kabbalah and Jewish philosophy. So it's themes that somehow developed into and became very central within the Kabbalah, and you have that. And of course, what you also have is that when you look at the Talmud, you have very fine, sometimes extremely abstract and very precise analysis, conceptual analysis of terms, right? Especially this kind of conceptual analysis developed in Lithuania at the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century. And you can say, is that philosophy? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's an examination of notions such as responsibility, causation, agency. It's very fine. It's very precise. I think that in some ways you can definitely call it philosophy. Or if you wish, you can say, well, I can create philosophy by engaging with these things. And I think that these kind of attitudes, this kind of development of engagement with high sophisticated abstract rabbinics is something that is, we see these kind of developments very recently over the past 10, 20 years.
In our book, we have a section called New Directions, which engages specifically with Talmudic analysis in a philosophical way, just as Yitzhak said.
Great. So let's take an example. A philosophical problem that has been ever present in the discussion is, what is the nature of God? And there are scriptural interpretations and all of that sort of stuff, but there's this basic idea in Judaism that God is one. Judaism is a monotheistic religion. It can look at Christianity, for example, and argue that it isn't monotheistic despite their self-image. But even within the debate, the philosophers are going to disagree about what this means. So without it being a 4-hour lecture, which is, of course, what's required, how does a philosopher, what does it look like for a person doing Jewish philosophy to have a philosophical conversation about what it means for God to be one?
I tend to think that basically at the end of the day, Judaism does not have dogmas. I mean, there were attempts to create Jewish dogmas. They were colossal failures, right? I mean, the Maimonides famously formulated the 13 principles of faith, and the common joke among Maimonides scholars is that the real question is whether he believed in 7 or only 6 of his 13 principles. So, I mean, when he writes the guide, he doesn't bother even to spend half a page in order to refer to these 13 principles. What we do know is that virtually in almost any question of theology, there are debates, just like as the debates that you have in the Talmud. So precisely, for example, just to give you to address the issue of monotheism, we know that there is a group of Kabbalists, especially one specific Kabbalist called by the name of Abraham Abulafia, 13th century Spanish and Sicilian Kabbalist, that is attacking the Spanish Kabbalists because they think that there are 10 sfirot or 10 powers or perhaps even divine entities of sorts. And Abulafia is attacking the Spanish Kabbalists and saying, you are worse than the Christians because the Christians believe in 3 gods and you believe in 10. Right? Atem elu shilshu v'atem isartem. You made God into 10 entities. So in many ways, even the question of monotheism, I mean, in some degree, I mean, you will have a fight about it. And I think that there are some charges that in Kabbalah you might, I don't think that there is, at the end of the day, there is more than one Godhead or etc., but there is something interesting going on there. Now, with regard to the question of, for example, just to give you where you have huge difference between Judaism and medieval Christianity is the issue of panentheism or pantheism. I think that generally that the common assumption that in early modern and medieval Western Christianity, pantheism and panentheism were considered to be heresies. And within Rabbinic Judaism, it's pretty much the mainstream of the Kabbalah. I mean, there are some debates about it, but but it's something that time and again we find it, and people endorse it without. I mean, they're careful about it, but they endorse it very proudly.
So I'm going to again jump in before Paul comes back. I want to point out again what Yitzhak did because it is a very funny and very Jewish move, which is I said that one of the core beliefs in Judaism is that God is one, that it's a monotheistic religion. In our rituals, we use this phrasing all of the time. And Yitzhak came back and said, well, Judaism doesn't really agree on anything. And even this question of monotheism, it really means these different, we can't really put a finger on it. And this is, and then he talked about Maimonides and said, Maimonides has these 13 things that he wrote down, but the people who wrote about Maimonides, they don't really think he believed all 13. And this is that critical, suspicious mindset that I'm trying to describe that encapsulates a very different view of religious experience because it's not about belief and acceptance. The entire conversation is about undermining agreement and certainty at every point while also claiming to agree with each other and be in a common conversation. So I want to go back to you, Paul, but I want to ask a little bit more about some examples of how people argue about God. I wanted to highlight this essential experience of part of what makes Jewish philosophy and the Jewish experience different than the way that many of our listeners will experience religion, in that it's about disagreement at least as much, if not more, than it is about agreement. Anyway, so Paul, how do people who are doing Jewish philosophy argue about God?
Yeah, well, to amplify the points that have been made, I would say that if there's anything unifying in Jewish philosophical approaches to the question of God, it isn't any positive dogma, or which we might call monotheism. It is instead the critique of polytheism as idolatry. And you can engage in the critique of idolatry even if you're an atheist. And in fact, we'll find versions of the critique of idolatry that in more modern philosophy are undertaken by philosophers who are atheists, and they are engaging in a critique not only of religion, but of culture more generally. So, for example, you might find a critique of attributing the wrong sort of power to signs, or the role that certain cultural values play when treated as if they were divine within a given culture.
Can you give an explanation as to what you mean by that, or an example?
Well, there's a strong tradition of critique of polytheism and idolatry, which we certainly find in scripture. And the prophets already denounce the thought that the work of human hands should be treated as God. And then we see in philosophy that idea being extended so that any conception of God, where it really is a question of the concept itself or the sign itself being treated as if it were divine when it in fact is clearly a human artifact, that too would be subject to the critique of idolatry. And as I say, you don't have to be a theist in order to critique idolatry. And you can imagine a sort of radical version of the critique of idolatry, which would extend to traditional theism as well.
I just wanted to add something about, for me, I think that there is a sense in which I think you are encouraged to study and try to know God, but you do not have a duty to reach any specific conclusion, or at least for some Jewish philosophers, you don't have any duty to, for example, even to believe in God. That's an interesting thing. So you look at a figure like Hazdai Kreskas, who is in many ways a conservative, important rabbinic figure, and he insists on saying that no, you don't. There is no duty to believe in God, because what you believe is dictated by the information that is available to you. And if the information that is available to you tell you that God does not exist, you're just going to fool yourself if you believe in God. If the information is going to tell you that God exists, you should believe in God. What is your duty is to do your best to carry out an honest investigation. And there is a small point here on the side of Kreskas where Kreskas is saying, well, there is a reward and punishment, but the reward is for the fact that you are happy or unhappy with the result of your investigation. So if you are a miserable atheist, that you adopted the view, the information that is given to you is that God does not exist, but you are unhappy with that, you will be rewarded for that. On the other hand, if you are you are unhappy believer, meaning the information that is given to you is that necessitates the existence of God, but you hate that, that's a wrong thing. So the attitude, what is right and wrong, is not so much the content of your belief, because the content of your belief must be completely dictated by the information that is available to you, and you must follow your rational investigation as much as you can. Just you might have a different attitude toward the results of your investigation.
So this, too, is an interesting contrast for our listeners to notice, which is there is this idea that some people might find surprising, that there is no duty to believe in God, that you don't have to have, and we'll come back to this, I hope, later, this faith. But what there is this obligation to learn, to study, to investigate, to process. And because we all live where we live and have the experiences that we experience, if your study and your day-to-day life gives you no evidence that God exists, you look at the evil in the world, you look at whatever, and you say God can't possibly exist, to say that God exists despite your conviction otherwise is to be dishonest. So there's this process of intellectual honesty, intellectual commitment. So I guess the question that comes from that is, does the tradition prioritize the individual intellect? Is there a sense that what is valuable is every person's commitment and process and experience of contemplating the big pictures, having discussions about the ideas, exploring these things? Is there a power of the individual that overrides the power of the whole conversation? What's more important, being a part of the whole and contributing to the tradition, or being your own person and committing to your own study and questioning and investigations? Is the individual of importance in this discussion?
Well, I think there's something illusory about the idea that there's a forced choice here. Now, in introductory philosophy classes, one often starts with Descartes' Meditations, and one is put in the position of the solitary meditator, not in dialogue or discussion with anyone, disavowing everything that one has learned from one's teachers and parents. But I think we can also recognize that there's something illusory about that. I mean, the language that is being spoken is the one that one learns from one's parents and teachers. There are assumptions in Descartes' texts that come straight out of pre-Cartesian philosophy and so on. So I would say that it is characteristic of Jewish philosophy not to support this illusion, to see us always as already involved in a dialogue and discussion between the generations, which is what the Talmud exemplifies. And the individual is important, but is always also already part of a conversation and a dialogical context.
Just to follow up on, I think, on Paul's point, I think that one way to exemplify, I think, that this very point is just if you look at the Jewish liturgy, there is no unity of belief there. I mean, you find there hymns that were supposed to exemplify the radical negative theology of figures like Maimonides. And on the next page, you'll find some Kabbalistic, highly anthropomorphic descriptions of God, one next to the other. Again, if you study these texts, and you need to be able to negotiate, to think about both of these possibilities. They are part of your horizon. And eventually, you need to think about what are the possible ways, which one you prefer, which one seems making more sense to you. And there are, of course, all kinds of combinations and syntheses between these views. I find it fun. So you have, in that sense, I mean, every single moment, as long as you're carrying out your investigation in a fair manner and with respect to previous generations, in many ways, there are hardly any limits on where you're supposed to land at the end of the process.
This also is a thematic tension between the way that people will frequently think about religion, in that there's something tremendously powerful about the lineage, the history of being part of the tradition that overrides the future aspect. And even, do I commit my faith? One of the ambiguities in Jewish texts is the word Israel, because most of the time people will think of it as the state of Israel that exists, since 1945 in the Middle East. But Israel refers to, when it's used in this context, all of the Jews who have lived throughout history where they are as a group. And so the way that I will tell my students is that there's the state of Israel and there's the nation of Israel, and that Jews are all part of the nation of Israel, even if they never step foot in the land. This sense of connection to the past and time is so important. And that leads to Abraham Heschel in his wonderful book on the Sabbath, on why the rest day is so important, argues that in Judaism, time is sacred, but place is not. That there's something special about time, and that the day of rest and the day of celebration is the closest thing to understanding heaven because it's temporal. It's a celebration of time. How do we look at those ideas as philosophers? What does it mean to value time from a philosophical perspective as opposed to a theological and liturgical perspective? Or does that division make no sense? Is it all just questioning, answering, investigation? How does a Jewish philosopher explore the idea of sacredness and time as a philosophical problem as opposed to a matter of belief and ritual?
Well, I would say that Heschel's idea of the Sabbath as a sanctuary in time explains something about Jewish survival. It was something that was portable, like the tradition of study, and it could be taken into the diaspora. But I don't think Heschel means to reject the idea that there is a sanctity of land as well. It's just that that's not something that is portable in quite the same way, except insofar as, say, the synagogue or the study hall become sacred spaces, and they are also portable.
There are many views within the Jewish philosophy and religious thought, but the Hebrew word for place is actually one of the names of God, Hamakom. That place is literally one of the names or one of the words that are used to refer to God. Is there a notion of a sacred place? Yes, you have that. And there is, of course, a notion that the entire universe is in God. So we know about a certain Talmudist, I think it's 3rd century, 4th century Talmudist, who was blind and was asked to, and he basically told his sister, is the person who was working with him, and asked him put me in the direction of whatever direction you wish, because God is everywhere. God is not restricted to any specific place. Again, panentheism, or the view that God is everywhere, or the rabbinic formulation of this claim that God is the place of the world, but the world is not his place, is very common, extremely common.
Good. I'm glad you brought that up because you mentioned the terms earlier, and I want to explain them and then ask a question. So there's this idea, pantheism, which argues that God and nature are one and the same. And then there's panentheism, which argues that God and nature are one and the same, but the collective of nature is something more than nature, and that is God. So God exceeds the sum of its parts. And the example I always give is, yes, the Beatles are John, Paul, George, and Ringo, but the Beatles are something much more than John, Paul, George, and Ringo when they are together. So we have this idea that God is place, both in the small sense and in the very, very large sense. And that helps us understand one theory as to what a monotheistic God might look like. But the person who is most famous, and this is going to be an oversimplification, but the philosopher who is most famous for saying something like this is Spinoza. And yet Spinoza got excommunicated for arguing his philosophy as heretical. So first of all, do we understand Spinoza simply as just one philosopher of many, and we're going to agree or disagree, whatever? And second, if there is so much disagreement, how can someone be excommunicated for believing the wrong thing?
Jack, I'm sorry. I'm not aware of any evidence that Spinoza was put on cherem because of his belief in panentheism. Spinoza believed in panentheism, and indeed he is pointing out similarities between his panentheism and the panentheism in the Kabbalah. And when you look at the rabbis who cite the cherem, one of them is Shaul Mortera himself. When you look at his sermons, they're full of panentheistic statements. So we can discuss the reasons for the cherem on Spinoza. I mean, this might be an occasion for another discussion, but I don't think that the reason is, to be honest, I don't think the reason is panentheism, because literally almost all of the rabbinic figures in the Spanish Portuguese community of Amsterdam were themselves panentheists.
So let me then just rephrase the question, because I'm not a historian and I'm on the edge of my capabilities. But if disagreement is so essential to the tradition, how can there be a conception of exile or exclusion? Doesn't that assume that you have to agree on something? How can you have a requirement for some form of agreement if the tradition is all about disagreement?
Well, because there are some definitions that you wish to keep, for example, the authority, rabbinic authority, and the authority of the community. So what happened in Amsterdam was a world capital in Jewish history of the use of cherems. And it's also clear why it was the case, because it was a community of conversos who returned to Judaism. They were trying to reassert their religion, and they were learning what it is to be Judaism. And so they were excessively trying to guard the boundaries, much more than most other communities. Now, most of the haramot, most of the excommunications in Amsterdam in the 17th century were related to the most traditional issue, which is accepting the authority of the leadership, whether it's the secular or religious leadership. I mean, in Amsterdam, it was mostly the secular, the Melamed, that had the upper authority. And I think that in the case of Spinoza, again, at the end of the day, I think that the reason why he was probably put on cherem was because he went to adjudicate outside the Jewish community, and as a result, he was basically disrespecting rabbinic law that they say, saying that the community must have its own autonomy and ability to adjudicate on all issues internally.
This is a really helpful clarification because it echoes or it foreshadows a conversation we're having in contemporary discussion. Part of what you're saying, as I understand it, is much like in Athens, they killed Socrates, not for his idea, but for political reasons. They were doing something similar in Spinoza. He wasn't respecting the authority of the community, of the people in power. How much is Jewish philosophy governed by and intertwined with the real politics that people face? I think in the United States, I'm thinking of conversations about abortion and the pressure to not just the outward pressure to create laws that reject abortion because people think it's immoral, but also the pressure as a Christian to disapprove of abortion in order to feel like a good Christian, right? We have political consequences, our belief, but there are also political motivations to make people believe a certain thing in order to have a vision of what a good religious person is. How much is the philosophy affected by the real world politics, and how much do power relations and normal human social stuff define the way that people are going to engage in philosophical problems and come to specific answers? And I guess another way of asking this question for the audience is it at all possible to separate the religious ideas and religious convictions with the real world experience of the people who identify as part of that community, as part of that religion?
I don't think there's anything exactly equivalent to the abortion issue, but if there's a third rail within Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy, it's the educational curriculum. So it was Maimonides' inclusion of philosophy within the code and within the curriculum, his attempt to substitute his own code for the extensive study of Talmud. That was what was most controversial. And again, in the late 18th, early 19th century, the idea of changing the traditional Jewish educational curriculum, that led to people being banned and all sorts of political machinations and so on. That's really been the issue, not any specific doctrinal issue.
Jack, I'll give you try to suggest two episodes, nice historical episodes. The one, I think, is the one that also Paul was referring to earlier. We know that after the publication of the guide, there was an attempt to ban Maimonides in the study of philosophy in some areas in Provence and perhaps in Spain. And and there was actually a cherem, an official cherem banning the study of philosophy. Whether it pertained to the guide or not, it's a fair question. What was the response of the followers of Maimonides? They just announced a counter cherem, what we call cherem adraba. And so they banned anyone who was banning Maimonides. So it's feel you want to engage in bans and cherems, go ahead, feel free. The sword that you are using might eventually be used against you. Now, just to give you a similar example, about 5 centuries later, we had a figure by the name of Jacob Endin. He is a kind of a precursor of, perhaps in some ways, precursor of the Jewish Enlightenment. He was the figure that Moses Mendelssohn considered to be his rabbinic teacher or rabbinic authority. And we know that Endin himself, because of these enlightened tendencies, he was really enraged by the religious views expressed by Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed, to the extent that at some point he was saying, perhaps there were two Maimonides. Perhaps there was one person who wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, and there was another person also named Maimonides that wrote the legal code, which is the Mishneh Torah. Eventually, he said, no, it cannot be the case. Even in the legal code, in the Mishneh Torah, there are significant philosophical issues which are fitting the guide, so it cannot be that there were two Maimonides. So now, given all of this, you'd say, okay, that's the crazy view, that the bold or the conservative view of a figure that is associated with the Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah in some way. But then move forward 30, 40 years, and then in the middle 19th century, you find Hasidic figures of Israel of Rojin, who is saying, oh, I was not aware that this guy, Jacob Emden, was saying these bad things about Maimonides in the guide. If it were the case, I would not give an approbation to the publication of the writings of Jacob Emden. Now, the person who is making this claim himself, Israel of Rojin, is a major Hasidic figure in the mid-19th century. So suddenly, the Hasidic figure is defending Maimonides and the guide from the attacks by the so-called semi-enlightenment figure of Jacob Emden. The story is complicated, no? It's politics of philosophy, and the story is not always linear. The story once you trace it, it gets much more interesting and fun.
I'm going to come back in a second to Hasidim because it's a very interesting example, and also there are many Hasidic Jews in the world today that hold to their beliefs. But I want to follow up on another thread, which is Maimonides is in discussion with Islamic philosophers and influences Christian philosophers. So Maimonides, Ibn Rushd, and then eventually Aquinas in the Catholic tradition argue about how to interpret the scripture, whether or not you can use metaphor and allegory, or it has to be understood literally. And part of the discussion is about who gets to read and who gets to have an opinion. What's the role of experts? How does a novice read the scripture in order to learn from it? The question I want to ask is, how does the Jewish tradition regard and treat non-Jewish texts and ideas? Is there a sense that the tradition has to be preserved and prioritized? Is there a kind of purity? Or does anything count? Any input is useful? And for lack of a better way of saying it, all ideas are equal, no matter who says it or where they come from. You just have to be persuasive and make an argument for it. How much does the Jewish tradition interact with and rely on, this is a leading question here, but the Greeks and the Romans, but more specifically, the quote-unquote competition, Islam, Christianity, even in some cosmopolitan places, Hinduism and Buddhism? How much is it an open tradition and a permeable tradition, and how much does it protect itself in terms of some kind of authentic voice?
Well, I think it's obvious that there's enormous amounts of interaction, and you could easily argue that Jewish philosophy originates in that interaction. It's arguable that the first instance of Jewish philosophy, strictly speaking, comes out of exchanges between Jewish philosophers and the Greeks in the context of the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. But as will be expected by now, there is not one view that answers your question. So on the one hand, Maimonides says you should accept the truth from any source that gives it to you. On the other hand, as in Christianity, you will find in some Jewish texts the idea that, say, Plato studied with the prophet Jeremiah, and that various ideas among the non-Jewish cultures, in fact, derive from Jewish sources. And that's just a way of sort of both authorizing the interaction and at the same time insisting on the authenticity and purity of one's own tradition.
Jack, if I may, just to illustrate this, the very same point, I mean, it's something that occurred to me just a year or 2 years ago. So one of the leading Hasidic journals in Israel published 2 years ago some of the writings of Abraham, the son of Maimonides. Now, Maimonides himself had some Sufi tendencies. I mean, he was influenced by Sufi mystics. I mean, we know that, it's documented, but his son, Abraham, was far more than that. I mean, in many ways, he adopted time and again more and more Sufi customs, with the one exception, with a Dikar, I mean, no pronouncements of God's name. Then 2 years ago, about a year after October 7th, you find an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic journal publishing an article in which they explain that the views or the practices of Abraham, the son of Maimonides, are really the practices that belong to the prophets of Israel, Nevi'ei Israel. These practices were lost among the Jews, and the only ones who conducted them were just the Sufis. And therefore, once you are just readopting them, you are just returning to Jewish sources. Now, it's precisely as Paul pointed out, it's a way of legitimizing the adoption of pretty radical, bold philosophical views or bold religious customs from Sufi mystics, as it was in Egypt. And the interesting thing is that this kind of stuff is happening again in ultra-Orthodox Hasidic journals 2 years ago, and that's fine. I mean, it is happening. No one is crying against that. I think that's, again, life is complicated.
Yeah, Yitzhak and I might privately smile at such claims, but the fact is that they, in fact, authorize interaction with a broad variety of traditions and ideas, no matter what their source is.
It makes me think of one of my favorite movies, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where there is a character, a father, who his favorite pastime is talking to people and saying, give me any word and I will tell you it's Greek in origin. And someone says kimono, the Japanese dress, and he thinks about it for a second, and then he creates this history of the word because his argument is anything good has to be Greek by definition. So there's going to be people who are like, oh, this Sufi idea is wonderful. This Platonic idea is wonderful. It must be Jewish. And that's just a human characteristic, which is really fun.
It is, but keep in mind, it's also kind of, in many ways, it can also be kind of very humane and a loving attitude. I'm thinking about Hasidic figures, for example, in the 19th century in Jerusalem, that were going among the Palestinian Arabs in the old city of Jerusalem, because they were believing that by looking at the music of the Palestinian Arabs in Jerusalem in the mid-19th century, they can recover the old melodies of the temple. And yes, it is, as you point out, it is saying, okay, these are our melodies, but it's also a kind of a very warm and welcome attitude towards the melodies of the other. And, I think that's precisely what should be there and should be celebrated.
I think that's a really important reminder that it's easy to see these things as playing for your team, partisan, whatever, but that openness to other ideas and the idea that someone else's idea may be adopted to you is very much a celebration of the legitimacy, the beauty, the equal worth of all people who can contribute. We don't have a lot of time, but there are two questions that I want to ask before we end. The first, we've been talking about Hasidic Jews quite a bit. For those folks, again, who aren't aware of the landscape, like every religion, Judaism has more modernist, liberal, progressive, and more conservative, old-fashioned, and backward-looking, and I mean historically, denominations like the Amish or something like that, people who reject modern dress or technology and things like that. The Hasidic movement is a movement that emphasizes emotion and passion. They're known, and this is mentioned in the book too, they're known for getting drunk. If you've ever had a Shabbat dinner, Sabbath dinner with Hasidic group Chabad, they get really drunk and they sing and it's festive and it's wonderful. How much is the distinction between emotion and reason, between intimate experience, celebration, enthusiasm, and rigid, strict study, how much does that permeate the whole tradition? A lot of religions have this division between the celebratory, expressive, even anti-philosophical attitude that you're not supposed to think, you're supposed to feel. Whereas there are other people who say, well, you're not supposed to feel, you're supposed to think. Is that also a fault line in the whole tradition, or is that really a modern thing where modern means from the 19th century onward?
Well, Jack,
At the risk of massive historical generalization.
Yeah, I've backed you into a corner. I apologize.
Yeah, I would say that ascetic practices, denial of the pleasures of the flesh, were more dominant in much of Jewish practice in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But they coexisted with some other views that could go in a totally different direction. The thought that everything comes from God, including bodily pleasure, and that therefore it too should be enjoyed with the right attitude. And more recently, in the last few centuries, we've seen a general repudiation of ascetic practices, although I'm sure there are still groups that engage in them, and the promulgation of the idea that the enjoyment of this world and of the pleasures of the flesh, again, done appropriately, done with the right attitude, is a central part of worship. Hasidism has emphasized that, but it has also spread to the non-Hasidic parts of the Orthodox world as well.
Jack, I mean, I think your question cuts very nicely into the one major split over the past 2 centuries among Ashkenazi Jews, because usually we refer to Ashkenazi Jews as split between Hasidim and Litvakers. The Litvakers are the intellectual, the the analysts, the more rigid. I mean, usually, you think about a Litvak trying to sing something. If you try to hear Lechadodi by a Litvak, I mean, you are not going to enjoy too much. I mean, it's a lost case. And Hasidim are supposed to be the ones that are really, they are praying excitedly and singing, etc. And are not learners and are not intellectuals, etc. I happen to grow up in, just as a matter of total historical accident, in one Hasidic community that actually was located, comes from Lithuania, and as a result, they actually identified both practices. So their study, their study of Torah is highly intellectual, uh, highly Lithuanian style of study. And on the other hand, their practice of prayer is that they pray aloud. They virtually shout the entire prayer from the beginning till the end. Okay, so which was the custom of we know this, at least the first or second generation of Hasidism. So yes, you have divisions, and of course you have precisely the figures that are going to stand in between the two camps and say, well, I'm on both, right? And that's the beauty of the story.
I want to tie things up by expressing a concern that I alluded to in the monologue, and we haven't used the term, and I don't particularly want to talk about it, but there is always this concern about anti-Semitism. And one of the great criticisms that non-Jews who don't like Jews make is Jews are isolated. Jews, they think they're chosen and better than everyone else, that they're a segregated community, and that's why all these bad things happen to them. What I guess I want to ask both of you as we end the conversation is, how does the tradition, first of all, I mean, we've sort of answered this already, but why is that unfair? But second, how does the tradition deal with otherness, both in terms of being another and seeing people as others? How does the tradition deal with the universality of human beings, all being God's creation, and the separateness of having some beliefs as opposed to the other? How does Jewish philosophy acknowledge and talk about the tension between separateness and commonality, both philosophically and in terms of engaging in practices in a practical, larger world?
Well, I would say, first of all, that Jewish philosophy, like many other aspects of Jewish life, and indeed Jewish life itself, has been challenged to an unusual extent to prove its own right to exist. And yet, the things with which Jewish philosophy is charged are in fact themselves features of every other tradition. So as I mentioned before, there's a sort of illusion of universality. The Greek culture portrayed itself as the universal human culture. And then it was up to Judaism to prove itself and Jewish thought to prove itself. The same with the Roman and in general with majority cultures, especially when they've taken an imperial form, as they very often has. But the particularity of Jewish tradition, is it really so different from the particularity of any tradition? And I suggested earlier that the universality is not simply a stable achievement of any one discourse, but it's the process of translation itself. And that's something that is both the water in which Jewish philosophy swims, and it's also very much the theme of Jewish philosophy, the idea of translation. And secondly, I'll add to that, the most challenging case of translation with which Jewish philosophy deals is divine revelation, because there's both the insistence on the radical otherness of God and on God speaking to particular human beings, particular human families, particular human peoples. And again, you don't have to be a theist to find that really philosophically interesting. And there is an ethical tradition within Jewish thought that both treats divinity as radical otherness and also treats the particular human being as created in the image of that otherness, so that it's respecting the otherness and the possibility of dialogical engagement at the same time that is the key to ethics.
Jack, I'll say this. I'm not a fan of the belief in the election or the chosenness of the Jews. I mean, not because I think it's necessarily racist. I think that actually its origins are not racist. And I'll be more explicit. I think that generally the bulk of this view is that Jews are willing to take some extra commitments beyond the commitment to morality, and there is some kind of reward for this kind of extra commitment, but nothing more than that. Right? All this being said, I think that the issue of chosenness is, at least when I was growing up in an ultra-Orthodox city as a child, it was not subject of much of the debates. I was studying the Talmud. I mean, most of the Talmud has nothing to do with that. I mean, it's basically totally different issues. And I think that the view that should be accepted, because you don't want to become even close to views which I think are problematic, I would suppress them as much as I can. I mean, that's at least my tendency. I think that you understand where some of these views, for example, the views of Yehuda Levi and the Kuzari, they came out from a period of abuse, in which Judaism was taken to be completely inferior. And it's natural that in response to that, you will have some sort of jingoism that coming from the other side. But again, I think that the attitude should be just, we are particulars just like everyone else. I don't think that there is, frankly, I think that the whole talk about universalism is a little bit of violence. I mean, because it's an attempt to say, I'm representing the kind of universal view, but you are not. You are representing one specific tradition. It's very nice. Perhaps you are more than other people, but that's it. And all of these various traditions, in their particularity, they should flourish one next to the other, and they should have a conversation, a human conversation among them, nothing more than that. And I think they should all accept the basic equality between all of them. Is that something that I think can be grounded within rabbinic thought? Yes, very much so.
That's a very poetic and important way of ending our discussion, because, of course, we want to invite everybody into the human discussion that we are having on the radio so that everyone can participate in one way or the other. And I set up an unfair problem for both of you, because in 80 minutes, you had to represent thousands and thousands of years of philosophy with thousands and thousands of voices. Nevertheless, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Why, this super interesting, hard conversation that touches upon these great questions of what's different, what's the same, and how to think about it philosophically, even as our hearts and our emotions, our souls are reaching out for more information. So, Paul, Yitzhak, thank you so much for joining us on Why.
Thank you.
It was my honor. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Why, Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. I've been interviewing Paul W. Franks and Yitzhak Melamed about Jewish philosophy, and I recommend looking at the Oxford Handbook of Jewish Philosophy. The link will be on our page. And I will be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyinpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We've been asking the question, what is Jewish philosophy? And in a very Jewish way, I'm going to end the episode with a joke. And the thing that you have to know in order to get the joke is that at the end of the religious service, there's this thing called mourner's Kaddish, where you say prayer for people who've died either recently or just on the anniversary of their death. And some synagogues will have the whole congregation stand for the prayer, and some congregations will only have the mourners stand for the prayer. And the joke goes like this. A new rabbi walks into his synagogue and does the service and makes everyone stand for the mourner's Kaddish. And so the elders of the synagogue, the board, get very upset, and they tell him they have to do it the old way. We let people sit. The rabbi says no. They decide to have a big debate and vote. So the head rabbi asks everyone the question, should people stand or not? And everyone votes in favor of sitting except the new rabbi. And so the guy who's running the meeting says, okay, we have a vote. It's 6-1 in favor of sitting. And all of a sudden, God's voice booms out over through the air and shakes the room and says, the young rabbi is right. You should stand. And the guy running the meeting says, all right, 6-2. And that is the core of what it means to engage in Jewish philosophy and Jewish debate, which is every voice is a legitimate voice. And just because you're God doesn't mean anyone has to listen to you. And when you reflect on this episode, you will hear that virtually every answer is, this is a controversy, not a conclusion. This is a debate, not a catechism. And that makes Judaism a very particular experience that a lot of folks find confusing and find surprising. And if nothing else, I want to underscore the idea that religion doesn't have to be blind faith. Religious belief is completely compatible with questioning, challenging, and not knowing the answers. With that, you've been listening to Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. This was our 200th episode and our 18th season. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Why is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, Prairie Public Broadcasting, and the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Research and Economic Development. The music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Lua E Soul. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com or myspace.com/Mark Weinstein. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.